you right now and explaining to you the moral story of Cobra Kai and the Karate Kid. So, as you guys know, Mr. Miyagi was a former U.S. Army soldier in World War II. And if you know anything about World War II, there's a certain moral standings that the U.S. had to take. In other words, you could argue and say that the United States at the time had to fight a war that was a lot more righteous in terms of self defense, as opposed to, let's say, Vietnam. And by the way, Vietnam in this particular concept sort of relates to Cobra Kai, whereas with, let's say, World War II relates a lot with Mr. Miyagi. And they're contrasting philosophies. You see, during Vietnam, there was a lot of turmoil in terms of political uh, dissidence with Americans. In other words, many people lost trust of their government. A lot of people sort of felt like, you know what, this war is immoral and there's no reason to be there. As opposed to, let's say, World War II with Mr. Miyagi. Whereas everything was about self defense, everything's about fighting for your rights and fighting for your freedom. And you can argue one way or the other. I'm not here to present to you whether that's true or not, but that is the overall reality and the sentiments that a lot of people have when it comes to World War II. Now, how does that relate? Mr. Miyagi's entire concept is basically about, how do I say this? Self defense. Everything is about defense, not offense, not going after the enemy or the opposition, but rather fighting in the name of defense rather than in the name of aggression and offense. Whereas with Cobra Kai, guess what? What was their whole entire concept of Cobra Kai? Their entire concept was strike first and strike hard. Why? Because during Vietnam, that was the overall consensus that U.S. soldiers had to take when they were being ambushed. When not only they were being ambushed, but also just fought in a way where it was so unconventional that at times they had to question their own morality and how they were going to go about it and how they were going to fight this war that was very unpopular back home. So, in other words, you can't blame Cobra Kai in one way or the other for being the way that they are. Because here's the psychological aspect that I'm going to really drop on you guys right now. When you're fighting a war that is so vicious that it really crosses the line of different morality standpoints, you sort of change your whole entire perspective in how you're going to react, how you're going to respond. Whereas with World War II and Mr. Miyagi, I got to tell you guys, that whole entire concept was a lot more clear cut. Now, this is not to say that America did not commit any war crimes in World War II, but certainly in Vietnam, it was almost like America had no choice but to commit these certain crimes in order for them to survive. The morale was low. A lot of the guys that were there, they were just sent, drafted, sometimes under against their will. And if you remember, obviously, this is one of the things that Muhammad Ali had fought against, which is the reason why Muhammad Ali had been stripped of his world championship during Vietnam. So, as you know, in the story of Cobra Kai, the leaders and the founders of Cobra Kai were American Special Forces guys that sort of developed this karate style, which again falls into the aspect of strike first, strike hard, and ask questions later, something to that extent, right? So there's a different morality standpoint that both of these particular generations had to face. Mr. Miyagi, a World War II vet, coming from an era that was a lot more clear cut in terms of what they were fighting for, and that Silver guy, what's his name? Yeah, the two leaders of Cobra Kai. Their whole entire concept was fighting a war that was unpopular, but at the same time, they had no choice but to basically come home safe and come home by any means necessary. So, how does this relate to modern combat sports? For one, you got a lot of guys that have different philosophies. There's guys in combat sports that have a philosophy of, let's say, being aggressive. And then there's guys that have a philosophy of, let's say, being more defensive than, let's say, being aggressive. And also, the personalities that are involved in mixed martial arts and boxing and all of combat sports sort of correlates to this. When you look at a guy like Colby Covington, does he not fit a description of somebody that would probably belong to Cobra Kai? Weirdly enough, it was Tyron Woodley, his former opponent, who was in Cobra Kai. Also, Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, who was also in Cobra Kai, also an enemy of Colby Covington. Nonetheless, Colby Covington fits the description of what it means to be a Cobra Kai. A guy that will mercilessly attack you and accomplish its mission by any means necessary. Whereas with Mr. Miyagi, he came from an era where it was a lot more simpler. In other words, the good guys versus the bad guys. The black and white hat of, let's say, the protagonist and the antagonist of the story. Whereas, when it comes to the modern times, and in particular, starting from the Vietnam era, it wasn't that easy to really pinpoint about who is the good guy and who is the bad guy. Can you confidently say in your mind that the United States of America during Vietnam were the good guys? I mean, all the atrocities that American forces had committed during that time. And at the same time, here's the thing. I'm not here to judge whether it was a plausible reason for them to do that or whether it was reasonable for them to act in such a vicious way. But the bottom line is, it is what it is, and they had to do what they had to do. And with that, their moral standpoint is going to be judged harshly by history as a result of it. Whereas with World War II, a lot of people sort of have this black and white aspect to that particular war, right? So in other words, if you're just joining me right now, what I'm basically trying to explain to you is that Cobra Kai is the influence of Vietnam, and Karate Kid and Mr. Miyagi's style of karate is the influence of World War II. Because in World War II, there was an aspect of defending oneself when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Whereas with Vietnam, it was sort of perceived as a sign of aggression. And not only that, it created the hippie movement. And not only that, it also made Muhammad Ali one of the most iconic figures in all of boxing's and combat sports history due to his defiance of being drafted into the war and only to be stripped of his title. And not only that, also sort of hindered his career in the long-term process, because when he came back, obviously he had fought Joe Frazier. How did that turn out? Not very good for Muhammad Ali, and believe it or not, ring rust matters to some people, not all fighters, but to some people, which again sort of brings into question Conor McGregor in that particular light. Conor McGregor is going to come back in a world where a lot of these guys have now fully developed, including Michael Chandler. Even though Michael Chandler has taken his losses and has taken his share of wins, the one thing you can't take away from the brother is that he is active. He's constantly improving himself. And not only that, he's also staying in the gym. Whereas with Conor McGregor, he's sort of not. He's partying his life away, right? And why would you not? You are in a certain position where you can do so. But nonetheless, going back to Cobra Kai and the Karate Kid, I also saw this particular video that was a deleted scene in Cobra Kai. It was Johnny Lawrence walking into a jiu-jitsu gym. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this. Maybe I should sort of link the video of this deleted scene in the community section of this page if you guys want to check it out, which I'm going to do later if and when I find that video. But let me explain the synopsis of this deleted video from Cobra Kai. So Johnny Lawrence runs across these jiu-jitsu instructors, right? And it was funny because, you know what? He said to the jiu-jitsu instructors, you guys are just a knockoff of karate, right? If you want to learn jiu-jitsu, why don't you go to Brazil or something like that? Obviously, it was in bad taste, and I could see why the producers of Cobra Kai decided to delete this scene. Only because it would have made them look bad in the world of martial arts and really rehabilitate their credibility as a martial arts brand. Because there is no denying the fact that jiu-jitsu is probably, not probably, but really one of the most effective arts to use, especially if you are taking on a guy that doesn't know how to use it. So that's also important to understand. When jiu-jitsu came in 1993, which was a couple of years after Cobra Kai, about 8 years after the first Karate Kid series had dropped on the on theaters, in came the introduction of jiu-jitsu in the world of American martial arts. There was this guy named Royce Gracie, for those of you that are too young enough to really have been around in the early 90s. The UFC started as a bare knuckle mixed martial arts organization, and it wasn't even called mixed martial arts then. At a certain point, they had to rename it, rebrand it, and all these other things. But nonetheless, Royce Gracie showed us that a little man with great technique and good grappling prowess can take on big men who didn't understand the art that was being done in front of them. So in turn, it changed the landscape of martial arts and what we know fighting to be. Even to the point where Joe Rogan has mentioned it several times when he constantly references all these street fight videos that he sees online. He says, you know what? Mixed martial arts and jiu-jitsu has changed the world and how they view fighting. In other words, people now are using chokeholds and wrestling single leg and double leg takedowns when they are in a street fight. Whereas back in the days, how people would do it was, you know what, we're going to put up our dukes and we're going to fight each other. We're going to go fight and hand to hand. And very few guys use kicks as a result of it. So, again, the evolution of martial arts in comparison to the 80s, when everything was about being hyper macho, being again, it's no different today, right? Being hyper macho and all that, but today we have a different concept in terms of how they view the world, right? How they view, let's say, parenting and whatnot, right? How they view, let's say, psychology. Whereas back in the days, if you had a problem with something, right, your whole entire MO was, you know what? Just get over it. Get on with it. That was the concept back then. And I'm talking about in the 80s. Whereas today, they have this new generation psychology that sort of tells you, well, you know what? It's not good for you to yell at your kids. It's not good for you to spank your kids. And by the way, I don't have a strong opinion on this one way or the other. I can tell you, I'm not a big fan of spanking kids, especially if you are a trained killer and a trained martial artist. But obviously, other parents who may not be skilled in that particular department, they may feel a little bit differently, only because of the fact that they don't understand the consequences of violence and the actions of violence that you can impend on a child that is far weaker than you. Now, you can use verbal warnings and verbal aggressions to get your point across, but then even with that, modern psychology sort of looks down upon that to a certain degree. But again, it sort of shows you that deleted scene with Johnny Lawrence as a way of sort of conveying a message that the world that we are living today is a whole lot different. You see, and speaking of Johnny Lawrence, if you guys take a look at his story in Cobra Kai, you notice that he wasn't the stud or the winner or the prom king that he was in high school, living his modern day right now, sort of working side jobs, odd jobs, and really not living a successful life in comparison to his opposition, which was Daniel LaRusso, who later on became a successful car business dealer in the valleys of Southern California. Whereas it sort of showed this entire story of the, how do I say this, the switching of the guard, or how the tables have turned in some sort of way, right? That's the best way to really put it. So the tables have turned in that particular aspect. Daniel LaRusso is now a successful car dealer, whereas with Johnny Lawrence is, well, not so successful. But when he was in high school, he was the man. He had everything going for him. And now things are different. Just like the world around you is different. The world around you is different from the time of the simpler times, as they call it, in the 1980s, right? Where everybody knew that, you know what, this is how a tough guy is supposed to look like. Nowadays, when you look at mixed martial arts, and 50 Cent has said this and described this in the best way possible. He said that mixed martial arts fighters, and this is coming from 50 Cent, okay? A guy who's been around boxers, a guy who's been around gangsters, a guy who's been around really rough human beings. 50 Cent said something to the extent of, the mixed martial arts fighter is not the traditional fighter. In other words, they are not the people that looks like a fighter, or somebody that looks like a roughneck, or somebody that looks like they can beat you up. Some of them, in fact, almost all of them, or if not the majority of mixed martial arts fighters, especially in the jiu-jitsu community, they all look like nerds, but they can beat you up, tie you up, and strangle you and hurt you in ways that you would have never even imagined just by their appearance alone. Now, that's not to say that modern mixed martial arts and boxing doesn't have traditional looking tough guys, guys that are street guys, guys that are gangsters, guys that come from a military background and doesn't take any S from anybody. Yes, these people exist, but the reality is that in the changing world that we're at, we're changing our perception on what it means to be a tough guy, for better or worse. And with that, you got to ask yourself, is the reason why a lot of people think that the world is being soft right now? And again, I agree with this certain notion. There are certain aspects of society that have become soft. But is it overstated or overestimated to the point where we're just saying that because the modern tough guys of today are not the traditional looking tough guys of yesterday? And let me give you another example of what I mean by that. Back in the days, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, and many others in that particular category were considered the tough guys of the world. Why? Even Mr. T, Hulk Hogan. Why? What do all these names that I had mentioned have in common? These 1980s figures, Hulk Hogan, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, Mr. T, and all of the above, right? What do they all have in common? They look the part. They look the part. You look at somebody like Sean O'Malley. Does he look the part? Probably not, but he's a world champion. Even Khamzat Chimaev. Does he look the part? Not in a traditional sense. You can tell Khamzat Chimaev is a killer. No doubt about it. There's no denying that. The only difference with Khamzat Chimaev is that he's a little bit skinnier. He's not somebody that looks like Arnold, but what we see him do in the cage is absolutely undeniable. You can't deny what Khamzat can do, but he doesn't look the part. He looks skinny. Even John Jones, the baddest man in the world. We all know he's the baddest man in the world. But guess what? You put him in a meme side by side with a bodybuilder, and it's going to say, how do I convince you that the guy on the left, which is John Jones, versus the guy on the right, which is, let's say, Kai Green, the bodybuilding world champion, can beat up this guy on the right, who's a bodybuilding champion? Trying to explain that to MMA casuals or people that don't watch mixed martial arts, fighting, boxing, and combat sports in general. How do you explain that? Well, I think that the world that we live in today, that sort of relates to this Cobra Kai and Karate Kid narrative, is that we live in a world today where we can prove everything by metrics. We can prove everything by competition. Because by the beginning of 1993, when Royce Gracie was able to choke out all these big guys, all these tough guys, and all these guys that can throw a little bit of a punch, throw a little bit of a kick, he made us realize that there's a difference between reality and there's a difference between fiction. In the 1980s world of martial arts culture, where the Grand Master was supposed to be perceived as the most dangerous guy in the dojo, but yet has never really been tested due to the fact that most martial arts gyms and dojos in that particular time set didn't have a competitive mindset. Of course, karate was always there, but again, karate is unfortunately very limited, but at the same time, it's also very effective. You look at the likes of Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, he's used karate to his advantage. You look at the likes of Michael Venom Page, he's another example of using karate to its great advantage. Conor McGregor has used karate to its advantage. There is great use of karate. However, there is a difference between the level of impact that you throw in karate as opposed to what you do in Muay Thai and other modern combat sports that is connected to mixed martial arts. So in other words, karate is effective in terms of being elusive, being defensive, as I've mentioned earlier in the stream, which is why I'm urging you guys to watch this particular stream from beginning to end so that you can understand the concepts and the dots that I'm drawing here. So karate, defensive, elusive, point style driven type of fighting. Whereas with modern martial arts, or not so modern martial arts, but rather Muay Thai and the compository sports of mixed martial arts attached to it, is sort of the in-your-face reality of knocking your head in and throwing kicks as if you're hitting them with a baseball bat, because that's literally what they teach you in Muay Thai schools. When you throw a particular kick, it is as if you are swinging a bat at your opponent, because of the motion and range of motion that you are generating from these kicks. Whereas with karate, it's a lot more elusive, it's a lot more point driven, and quite frankly, a whole lot more defensive. So that right there is my concept that I'm trying to explain to you with Cobra Kai and Karate Kid and how it relates to the modern history of martial arts and mixed martial arts in total, but also trying to understand the different societies that we have today as opposed to the different societies that we've had back in the days. So with that in mind, that right there is my 25 minutes. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Check out the new videos that I have out. Conor McGregor being lied to by Dana White on my live stream while I'm reacting to MMA Joey. Check that one out. Also, the video that I have of Jake Paul and Mike Tyson. And by the way, this sort of relates to this. That video that I made with Mike Tyson and Jake Paul. Now, given the fact that, let's say this is a real fight and not an exhibition, but I think at some point we're sort of leaning to the idea that we know this is an exhibition, right? Many people are picking Mike Tyson to win against Jake Paul. Why? Because many people, just like Johnny Lawrence and all these people that are stuck in the 1980s, really don't understand the progression of people and the progression of martial arts and combat sports in general in the world that we live at today. So that is my time. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I will see you guys in the near future, inshallah.